In my courtroom, the most common phrase I hear is, "It wasn't me." People always find ways to deflect blame. The weather, other drivers, bad luck. It's natural for us to protect ourselves, to push the blame away. But let me tell you about one Tuesday morning that changed everything. The room was silent, not because of an argument, but because of a whisper. It came from a man with nothing left to lose, who stood before me and said 4 words that stopped everything. It was my fault. His name was Thomas, no last name, just Thomas. His charge was serious: vandalism, destruction of property, and disorderly conduct. The arresting officer, Officer Miller, a seasoned cop who's seen it all, had written a baffling report. Thomas had thrown a brick through the window of Sal's market. But unlike most criminals, he didn't run. He sat on the curb waiting for the police. When the officers arrived, he calmly put his hands behind his back and confessed, "It was my fault." There was no attempt to escape, just an admission of guilt. I watched the security footage before taking the bench. The night was rainy, and Thomas could be seen pacing in front of the store. He wasn't drunk, wasn't angry, he looked desperate. Then he picked up a brick from a nearby construction pile, closed his eyes for a moment, and threw it. The glass shattered, and the alarm went off. Thomas sat on the wet pavement, pulled his knees to his chest, and waited. When Thomas walked into my courtroom, there was an immediate shift in the atmosphere. He was a small man, worn down by years of hardship. His coat was too big, held together by safety pins and duct tape. His mismatched shoes looked worn out. But despite his tattered appearance, there was a certain dignity in how he held his head. He didn't look at the floor. His tired eyes met mine with surprising clarity. Officer Miller, standing nearby, wasn't angry. His brow was furrowed like someone trying to solve a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out. "The case of the city versus Thomas," the clerk announced. Thomas stepped up to the microphone. He didn't wait for me to read the charges. He didn't wait for a lawyer to speak for him. He leaned into the microphone and with a raspy voice from the cold, simply said, "It was my fault. I broke the window. I did it on purpose. I am guilty." His words hung in the air. Usually I have to drag the truth out of people, but here was a man serving it to me without hesitation. It didn't feel right, though. Something about it didn't sit well with me. "Good morning, sir," I said gently, trying to make sense of it all. "I have the report here. You broke a window at Sal's market. Officer Miller says the damage was significant. Do you understand the charges against you?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. Vandalism. I understand." I glanced at Officer Miller. "Is that accurate?" I asked. "Yes, Judge," Officer Miller replied. "It was the strangest thing. Usually when we arrest people, we have to chase them down blocks. But when I pulled up, Thomas waved me over. He put his hands behind his back before I even got out of the car. He said, 'I'm the one you want. It was my fault.' He was polite, completely cooperative. I turned back to Thomas. "Sir, you weren't intoxicated. You didn't steal anything. You just broke the window and waited to be arrested. My question is why?" The silence stretched. Usually when I ask that question, I get a lie, a story about an accident or a misunderstanding. But Thomas looked up at me, meeting my gaze with heartbreaking clarity. "It was cold, Your Honor," he whispered. "Tuesday night it was 20 degrees. The wind was coming off the water. It cut through this coat." He pulled the thin, duct-taped fabric tighter around himself. "I went to the shelter on Broad Street. Full. I went to the one downtown. Full. I tried the church basement. Full. I sat in the alley for a few hours. I stopped shivering around 2 a.m. That's when I got scared. When you stop shivering, that's when you don't wake up." I felt a chill of understanding sweep over me. "So, you broke the window to get arrested?" I asked. Thomas nodded. "I knew if I broke the window, the alarm would go off. Officer Miller would come. He'd take me to the station. The holding cell is warm, Your Honor. They give you a bologna sandwich. It's dry, but it's food. And it's warm. I figured a broken window is better than a frozen body." The courtroom murmured as I absorbed Thomas's words. I looked at Officer Miller, then back at Thomas. This wasn't about a man trying to avoid punishment. This was about survival. I sat quietly for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what he had just shared. "Thomas," I began, my voice softening, "you caused $1,000 in damages to Sal's market because you were cold." "I know it was wrong," he quickly responded. "I like Sal. He's given me coffee before. I didn't want to hurt him. That's why I waited. I wanted him to know it was me so I could pay for it eventually or work it off. But I had to choose, Judge. Sal's window or my life. I chose my life." I looked back at the docket. I wanted to understand more about this man, the one who had come so close to freezing to death just to survive. Thomas, have you always been on the streets? I asked. My records show no prior arrests, no history of disturbances. You're 48 years old. What happened? Thomas straightened up a little, a flicker of his old self breaking through the grime. No, sir, I wasn't always like this. I worked as a machinist for years. I had a house. I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. We were happy. His voice cracked when he spoke her name. It was clear how much he had lost. Sarah got sick, he continued, his eyes watering. Cancer. The insurance didn't cover the treatments, the experimental ones. I couldn't let her die. We sold the house, spent the savings, maxed out the credit cards. I spent every dime I had trying to save her. He wiped a tear from his dirty sleeve. I lost her anyway, and when she died, I didn't have anything left. No money, no house, no reason to try anymore. I just drifted. His story hit me like a punch to the gut. Here was a man who had worked hard, loved his wife, and sacrificed everything for her. And then, when she died, he had fallen through the cracks of a system that did nothing to help him. So, you're telling me, I said, summarizing his story, that you're not a vandal, not a criminal. You're a grieving husband and a former machinist who just wanted to survive the night. Is that right? I am guilty, Your Honor, Thomas said, almost defiantly. I broke the law. I'm not asking for charity. I'm just telling you the truth. I looked at Salvatore Moretti, the owner of the market, who was sitting in the back row. He had come to demand restitution for the window, but as Thomas spoke, I saw something change in Sal's face. The anger drained out, replaced by something else. I called Sal up to the bench. Mr. Moretti, I said, you heard the defendant's explanation. He admits to breaking your window. He admits to causing the damage. Under the law, you are entitled to restitution. You have every right to demand he pay for the damage. But before Sal could respond, Thomas spoke up, his voice cracking. I will, Sal, I promise. I know I don't look like much right now, but I still have my skills. My hands are steady. I can fix things. If the judge lets me, if I can get some work, I'll pay you back every cent. Sal looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he sighed. It wasn't the sigh of someone frustrated by a debt, but the sound of a man reconsidering everything he had planned to do. I've seen Thomas around the neighborhood for years, Sal said, his voice gruff but steady. He never begs, never bothers the customers. Sometimes I even see him sweeping the sidewalk in front of the shop just to have something to do. The words caught me off guard. I had no idea Thomas had been helping out in small ways like that. Sal shook his head. I didn't know about his wife. I didn't know he was that desperate. Then, to my surprise, Sal reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. Judge, he said, I can't take money from a man who had to break a window just to keep from freezing. The insurance will cover the glass. It's a $500 deductible, but looking at him, he's paid enough. I don't want restitution. A collective breath escaped from the courtroom. It was a beautiful act of mercy. Thomas stood there stunned, unable to process what he had just heard. Sal, he whispered, you mean it? Sal simply nodded. Forget it, Tom. The relief in Thomas's face was palpable. The man who had been on the streets desperate for survival was now being offered something far more valuable than money, his dignity. I looked at Thomas, my voice softer now. You don't need to pay for the damage, Thomas, but we still have a problem. You've been charged with vandalism and disorderly conduct. Even if Sal forgives the debt, you still broke the law. But more importantly, if I dismiss this case right now, if I let you walk out that door, where will you go? The question hung in the air, and I saw the panic return to Thomas's eyes. This was the harsh reality. Mercy could look like freedom, but for Thomas, freedom meant the cold. Judge, please, Thomas said, his voice trembling. If you let me go, I'm back on the sidewalk. It's supposed to snow tonight. I checked the paper. It's going to be 15 degrees. Please, give me 30 days. Please, 30 days in county jail. It's warm there. They have blankets. I need that, Your Honor. It hit me. He wasn't asking for leniency, he was pleading for survival. If I sent him to jail, I'd be saving him from the cold, but I'd be ruining his future. He'd have a criminal record, no chance of getting government housing, no chance of rebuilding his life. I turned to Officer Miller, my mind racing. He was right. This was a trap. If I jailed Thomas, I'd be giving him warmth, but I'd also be setting him up for failure in the future. I sat there rubbing my eyes, trying to think of another way. There had to be a third option. There had to be a way to offer justice without condemning Thomas to a life of struggle. I took off my glasses, rubbed the bridge of my nose, and thought deeply. Then it came to me. "Thomas," I said, my voice steady but compassionate, "I'm not going to send you to jail. You're not a criminal. You're a man in crisis. But Your Honor," Thomas interrupted, his panic rising again. "Please, no jail. I'm not sending you to the streets either," I replied firmly. "But I am going to help you. I'm going to give you a chance." I reached under my desk, and to the surprise of everyone in the room, I pulled out my personal checkbook. The courtroom fell silent. Officer Miller's eyes widened in disbelief. In all his years of policing, he had never seen a judge pull out their own checkbook during a criminal docket. I opened it and began writing. The rustling of paper was the only sound in the room. I wrote the date and then the name of the Travelers Inn, a modest but clean motel just a few miles from the courthouse. I wrote the amount, $1,000. "Officer Miller," I said, "please approach the bench." Miller stepped forward, still looking bewildered. I handed him the check, and he glanced at the amount, then back at me, his mouth slightly open. "Your Honor, this is—" Miller stammered. "It's my personal account," I said, cutting him off. "This check covers 2 weeks of a warm room, hot showers, and 3 meals a day at the Travelers Inn. I'm remanding Thomas into your custody for exactly 1 hour. You are not taking him to the county jail. You are going to drive him to the inn. Can I count on you to execute this order?" Miller's eyes softened as he took the check. He tucked it into his front pocket, straightened up, and gave me a sharp nod. "Consider it done, Judge." Thomas stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. "Judge, no, I can't take your money. I don't deserve charity." I placed a hand on the podium. "It's not charity, Thomas, it's an investment in you. You told me you have skills, you told me you want to work, but it's very hard to get a job when you haven't slept, when you haven't eaten, when you're freezing to death. This is a chance for you to get back on your feet." I leaned in a little closer. "This is not just a gift. This is a contract. I'm buying you 2 weeks. 2 weeks of warmth. 2 weeks to rest without fear of freezing. In exchange, you will go to the Department of Labor. You will contact the services Officer Miller will give you. That's the deal. Do you accept?" Thomas gripped the podium tightly, his knuckles white. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I accept, Your Honor. Thank you." Thomas's tears were no longer tears of desperation but of relief. He looked up at me, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude in his eyes. He had just been given the chance to rebuild his life, not through punishment, but through mercy and understanding. Officer Miller, now with a softer look, placed a hand gently on Thomas's back. "Come on, Tom," he said, guiding him out of the courtroom. "Let's get you that hot shower." As they walked out of the courtroom, the room remained silent. I sat there for a long moment, reflecting on what had just transpired. I had given Thomas a chance to survive the night, but I knew it wasn't just about surviving. It was about offering him the dignity and the opportunity to stand on his own 2 feet again. I had done my part, but the real work lay ahead for Thomas. Just as I was about to call it a day, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my chamber door. Officer Miller walked back in, but this time he wasn't in his uniform. He was wearing plain clothes, a tired but energized look on his face. "Judge," he said, holding up a coffee cup, "I just wanted to let you know the good news. I dropped Thomas off at the Travelers Inn. The manager there, a good guy, gave him the corporate rate. The $1,000 check you gave him is going to stretch for 3 weeks instead of 2. He's got time to turn things around." "That's great news," I said, a sense of relief washing over me. But Miller wasn't finished. "I stopped by Sal's Market on my way here this morning," Miller continued with a grin. "And guess who I found there at 7 a.m., cleaning up the glass he broke?" I stopped what I was doing, stunned. "Thomas?" "Yep." He was sweeping the broken glass from the window, with a coffee in one hand and a broom in the other. He looked different, Judge. Clean, well-dressed, and working. He didn't look like a suspect anymore. He looked like a citizen. I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. This was exactly what I had hoped for when I gave Thomas that chance. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting to rebuild. 3 weeks later, I entered the courtroom expecting to see Thomas, perhaps looking a little better, with some progress to report. But what I saw made me pause. The courtroom was packed, a typical busy docket. However, in the middle of the aisle stood a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed in a pressed plaid shirt, clean khaki pants, and new work boots. His hair was cut short and neat, and his shoulders were back, walking with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen before. It took me a moment, but then it hit me. It was Thomas. He walked confidently to the microphone, holding a manila folder with both hands. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, his voice strong and resonant. It was a stark contrast to the raspy voice I had heard weeks earlier. "Thomas," I said, unable to hide my smile, "you look different." "I feel different, Judge," Thomas replied with a small but proud smile. He opened the manila folder and handed it to the bailiff, who walked it up to the bench. I opened it and found 3 documents. The first was a letter from the manager of the Travelers Inn, stating that Thomas had been a model guest, cleaned his room daily, and even helped fix a broken ice machine in the lobby. The second was a pay stub from Sal's Market, showing that Thomas had worked for 3 weeks, including hours of overtime. The third was a copy of a lease agreement for a small studio apartment, signed and dated for the 1st of the month. I looked up from the documents, my heart swelling with pride. "Thomas," I said, holding up the lease agreement for the courtroom to see, "in 3 weeks you've turned your entire life around. You went from a freezing alley to a lease on an apartment. This is what resilience looks like." Thomas smiled humbly. "S helped me," he said, nodding at Sal, who was standing behind him, beaming like a proud father. "Officer Miller checked on me every day, and the judge gave me a chance." I turned to Officer Miller, who stood at parade rest, a subtle thumbs up in my direction. It was clear that this was not just Thomas's victory, but a victory for the entire community that had rallied around him. "And Judge," Thomas added, his voice a little nervous, "there's one more thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp stack of bills, $500 bills. He placed them gently on the wooden railing of the defendant's stand. "I know you said it was an investment," he said, his voice serious. "I know you said I didn't have to pay it back, but I pay my debts, Your Honor. I earned every cent of this. Fixing the van, building the shelves, stocking the cooler, it's clean money." I looked at the cash, then at Thomas. It wasn't about the money. It was about him standing on his own 2 feet. He wasn't just offering repayment, he was asserting his independence. "Thomas," I said gently, "I can't take your money. I told you that was a gift, to get you started. Put that toward your new apartment. Buy some furniture. Fill your refrigerator." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, Judge, I have money for the deposit. I saved everything else. I need to give this back to you." He paused, his eyes drifting to the clerk's desk where the collateral, the silver locket, was kept. "I need to redeem my collateral. The locket." The locket. I had almost forgotten. It wasn't about the money for Thomas. It was about reclaiming the symbol of his love for his wife, Sarah. I nodded, signaling the clerk. "Bring me the sealed envelope marked Thomas." The clerk unlocked the drawer and handed me the heavy envelope. I held it up, looking at Thomas. "You don't need to pay me back for this. You earned it the moment you walked in here with that lease agreement. The deal was that you land on your feet. You've done that." I opened the envelope and pulled out the silver locket. It gleamed in the light. I held it out to Thomas. His hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't from cold or fear. It was from pure gratitude. He took the locket, not putting it in his pocket, but unclasping the chain and fastening it around his neck right there in the courtroom. He tucked the locket under his new plaid shirt, close to his heart. "I feel like I have her back now," he whispered. Just as I was about to bang my gavel and officially dismiss the charges, Officer Miller stepped forward again. "Your Honor," Miller said, his voice carrying a touch of mischief, "before you dismiss the defendant, there's one more person who wants to speak. Someone who saw what happened at the market 3 weeks ago." I frowned, confused. "A witness?" But he pled guilty. "We don't need witnesses." "Not a witness to the crime, Judge," Miller said, a mysterious smile on his face. "A witness to the man. She's been waiting outside." The heavy oak doors to the courtroom swung open, and a young woman stepped inside. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. She was dressed simply, clutching a handbag tightly with both hands, her eyes scanning the room nervously. She looked terrified, her hands flying to her mouth as she stifled a sob when her eyes landed on Thomas. Thomas froze. The color drained from his face, and he grabbed the wooden railing to steady himself, his legs nearly giving out. "Jenny," he whispered, barely audible. The woman ran down the aisle, ignoring the bailiff and the formalities of the courtroom. She sprinted to Thomas and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his new plaid shirt. For a moment, Thomas stood there, stunned, his arms hovering in the air as if he were afraid to touch her, afraid she wasn't real. Then, with a shuddering breath, he wrapped his arms around her, and they both broke down completely. "I'm sorry," Thomas kept repeating, his voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, baby girl, I'm so sorry." The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of their weeping. Even the stenographer had stopped, wiping her eyes. I glanced over at Officer Miller, who was beaming with pride, his usual stoic demeanor completely gone. Miller leaned toward the microphone and quietly explained, "Your Honor, when I ran Thomas's ID 3 weeks ago to get him into the housing system, a flag popped up. Not a criminal warrant, but a missing person report filed 2 years ago by her." He pointed at the young woman. "Jennifer, she's been looking for him since the house was foreclosed. I called her this morning and told her Thomas was going to be here." Jennifer pulled back from her father's embrace, framing his face with her hands. She gasped when she saw the locket around his neck. "Mom's locket," she whispered. "You still have it?" Thomas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I never let it go, not for a second." Jennifer looked down at the locket, her tears flowing freely. "I thought you were dead. I thought I lost you both," she said, her voice cracking. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't want you to see me like this, Jenny. I didn't want to be a burden, not after I lost the house, after I couldn't save your mom." "A burden?" Jennifer shook her head fiercely. "You're my dad. You're the only family I have left. I don't care about the house. I don't care about the money. I just wanted you." She looked down at the locket again, the symbol of her mother's love, then back at her father. "You've been looking for me?" Thomas asked, as if he couldn't believe it. "Of course I have," Jennifer said. "And now you're coming home with me, Dad. I have a spare room. The grandkids, Sarah and Mike, they miss their grandpa." Thomas's eyes went wide. "Grandkids?" he whispered. "2 of them?" Jennifer smiled through her tears. "Sarah's 5 now. She asks about you all the time." Thomas looked at me, then at the new lease agreement still sitting on the table. I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. He had worked so hard for his independence, for his own place. But family came first. "Go, Thomas," I said gently, motioning toward the door. "The lease can be broken. S will still need you at the market."